I was reading an article from the Wall Street Journal. It's called The Power Trap. Researchers have found significant changes in people who gain power. You ever seen any weird people who had lots of power? This article said it's an incredibly consistent effect. When you give people power, they basically start acting like fools. They flirt inappropriately, tease in a hostile fashion, and become totally impulsive. This is a serious article in the Wall Street Journal. Some have even compared the feeling of power to brain damage, noting that people with lots of authority tend to behave like neurological patients with a damaged frontal lobe, which is the brain area that's crucial for empathy. Thought that was interesting. I've seen lots of powerful people who act kind of like that. Maybe you have too. You know, possibly the greatest measure of somebody's maturity is how you or I handle authority, how we handle power, how we handle influence. In other words, how do you respond when it dawns on you that you're the most important person or the most powerful person in the room? Whether it's the boardroom or the family room at home or the classroom or the locker room or whatever room you're in, whether you're at work or with your family, at any moment, at any time when it dawns on you that you're the one in charge, you're the one who gets to make the decisions, you're the most powerful person in the room, what do you do in that moment? And what you and I do in that moment is the best reflection of our individual maturity. Think about it. When you see somebody with power or influence or authority, and they use it for their own benefit to the neglect of the people that they're responsible for, you hate that, don't you? I know I do. You know there's something wrong with that when people use their power only to benefit themselves, and they could care less about the people who are following them. When I was in the Navy, I had a executive officer like that. He was known for mistreating people. All he cared about was his own promotions. While I was in that squadron, my dad died suddenly. And so I went to ask for some leave so I could go to the funeral. And instead of being compassionate and caring, this XO started grilling me about how long I was going to be gone and did I really need to take that many days. And he never even said, sorry about your loss. There's just something wrong with people like that who have power but only use it for themselves. At the same time, there is nothing more inspiring when a leader has some sort of influence or some sort of authority who then says no to herself or no to himself, and they don't take advantage of their position, but they use their position to benefit other people. They use their power to help and bless people that have chosen to follow them. Some of our favorite stories are of men or women who have influence or power, whether it's a politician or maybe somebody you work for or somebody you work with, or maybe it's a parent. But they said no to themselves so that they were able to say yes to others around them, people that have chosen to follow them. People like Martin Luther King Jr., who was willing to go to jail so that his followers could gain freedom in their lives. We're in a series on David, so let's apply this to David's life. We've sort of been telling the story more than preaching in this series, and so we're going to continue telling the story this morning. But just to review, we started the story of David by talking about how the prophet Samuel came to anoint him as king when David was only maybe like 12 or 13 years old. And afterwards, David goes back to the sheep field. He's tending sheep again. It seems like nothing has changed, except that from that time on, David knew that God had something special for him. Well, a couple years later is when he kills Goliath. And he becomes an overnight sensation. For the next 7 years, he's the most popular guy in the whole kingdom. He's in the good graces of the king. He marries the king's daughter. He's best friends with the king's son, Jonathan. And for 7 years, things are going great. But then, as we saw last week, Saul gets jealous. And he's threatened by David, tries to kill him, so David becomes a fugitive from the law for the next 8 years after that. And for 8 long years, David is running from King Saul and his army, hiding with his band of several hundred other fugitives in the desert and the wilderness areas, trying to stay away from King Saul. And all the while, David knows that God has chosen him as the king, but he has no idea how that is possibly going to work out. Now, how many of you think that 8 years in the wilderness was kind of a mistake on God's part? You know, that David had anointed, God had anointed David to be king, but then took a nap or something. And 8 years later, he wakes up and he says, oh my goodness, I didn't realize all this time had gone by. I forgot about David. He's still out in the wilderness running from King Saul. Sorry about that, David. I just forgot about you, but I'll fix it now. No. God doesn't sleep, does he? No. There was a purpose for that time in the wilderness. David was learning some critical lessons in the wilderness, just like we talked about one of them last week with Abigail. And maybe the most important lesson that David learned during that time was this lesson, that it's not about me. It's not about me. It is about God's will, God's way, in God's time. In fact, I wonder if you've learned that lesson yet. I sometimes wonder if I've learned that lesson yet. Maybe you spent some time in the wilderness yourself and things didn't go like you planned and it didn't work out like you thought it would, and you went through some pain and some misery and some heartache, and maybe you learned during that time that it's not about me. It's about God's way, God's will, and God's time. That's why David was in the wilderness, to learn some lessons like that. And in fact, on 2 occasions during this time, David has an opportunity to kill King Saul. One time, David and some of his men are hiding in the cave, and King Saul is passing by with his army, and right in front of the cave where David is hiding, King Saul decides he has to go to the bathroom. And so he stops, he gets off his donkey, goes into the cave. David is hiding in the cave with his men, and their eyes are adjusted to the darkness so they can see him perfectly. Saul can't see them. He has no idea there's anybody else there. And Saul begins to do his business in the cave. And so he is in the most vulnerable position possible. And David's men turn to him and say, "Are you kidding? This is our chance." And in fact, here's how they put it in 1 Samuel 24, verse 4. The men said, "This is the day the Lord spoke of when he said to you, I will give your enemy into your hands for you to deal with as you wish." So his men are saying, wow, look at this opportunity to kill Saul. It must be God. And David almost falls for this. You may remember the story. He creeps up on King Saul. Actually, he's close enough that he cuts off the corner of Saul's robe. But as he thinks about killing him, he says, no. I will not take matters into my own hands. So Saul finishes, he goes out of the cave and gets on his donkey. They're about to take off. And then verse 8, it says, "Then David went out of the cave and called out to Saul, 'My lord the king.' And all of a sudden, everybody in the army stops and looks, and they say, 'Whoa, David was in that cave?' And they immediately know that David could have killed King Saul, but he chose not to. David says to Saul in verse 10, "This day you have seen with your own eyes how the Lord delivered you into my hands in the cave. Some urged me to kill you, but I spared you. I said, I will not lay my hand on my Lord because he is the Lord's anointed. I have not wronged you, but you are hunting me down to take my life. May the Lord judge between you and me. And may the Lord avenge the wrongs that you have done to me, but my hand will not touch you." For David, it has to be God's will, God's way, in God's time. Even though Saul has done evil to him, David will not respond to that evil. And then it happens again a few months later. Saul and his army are out hunting for David in the desert of Ziph, and David sent out some spies to track Saul's progress so that they can stay away from him. And a report comes back to him, hey, they've camped out for the night at this certain place. Well, David can't resist, so he takes a group of men over this hill, and they want to see the camp where King Saul's at. And they see King Saul with 3,000 men. He's camped in the middle of them. The men are all around. And late that night, David turns to his friend Abishai, and he says, Abishai, I have a really bad idea, but it might be fun. You want to go sneak into their camp? And Abishai says, yeah, sure, let's do it. So David and Abishai sneak into the camp, and all the guards are sleeping, and so they go right by them, right in the middle of the camp where Saul is lying asleep with his spear stuck in the ground next to his head. And Abishai sees this, and he whispers into David's ear in 1 Samuel 26, verse 8, today God has delivered your enemy into your hands. It's like, David, we missed this opportunity once before in the cave. You remember that? But now it must be God's will for you to kill him because, look, God gave us another chance. And so he says, now let me pin him to the ground with one thrust of the spear. I won't strike him twice. So Abishai is saying, David, you know, I know you've got all these religious convictions about killing the Lord's anointed, but God hasn't told me that I can't. And so, you know, just let me grab that spear and I will just thrust one time. That's all it'll take. And when the army wakes up and they see Saul is dead, they'll make you the king. What an opportunity. We can't miss this one. But David whispered to Abishai, don't destroy him. Who can lay a hand on the Lord's anointed and be guiltless? David says, no, I refuse to violate God's will in order to gain the blessing of God. I refuse to violate God's will in order to gain the promise of God. I refuse to violate the will of God, even to get what God promised me and anointed me for and what I deserve. I won't do it because this is not about me. It's about God's will, God's way, in God's time. However, he says, we can't have a little fun, Abishai. And so he says, you take Saul's spear and I'll grab the water jug. And then they sneak back out of the camp. They go up on the hillside, wait for the sun to rise. And when the sun comes up, David starts shouting. And first he shouts to Abner, Abner, Abner. Now, Abner is the chief of the king's bodyguard, which meant basically he was the highest general of the army. And he says, hey, Abner, are you missing anything? Hey, look around. You recognize these? The army is looking up. They recognize David's voice, even though he's a long way away. And they see that he's carrying Saul's spear and the water jug. And Abner looks around. Sure enough, Saul's spear and water jug are missing. And so David is making fun of Abner. Hey, you're supposed to be protecting the king, and you let us sneak right in and look at you. And then David starts talking to Saul. Here's what he says in 1 Samuel 26, verse 23. The Lord delivered you into my hands today, Saul, but I would not lay a hand on the Lord's anointed. As surely as I valued your life today, so may the Lord value my life and deliver me from all trouble. And then David and his men disappear into the desert again. And again, David refuses an opportunity to take power by doing it himself in his own way. David refused to replace what God had put in place. Why? God's will, God's way, in God's time. No other option for David. It had to be God's will, God's way, in God's time. Well, let's skip ahead a bit. Eventually, King Saul and 3 of his sons are all killed by the Philistines in battle. The men that stood in the way of David becoming the king are now gone. And instead of throwing a party that his enemies are finally dead, David actually mourned the deaths of King Saul and Jonathan. Right till the end, he honors them because of the fact that God had put them in their place of authority. And David would not replace what God had put in place. Now, Israel had 12 tribes. The largest one is Judah in the south, which happens to be the one that David is from. And so now that Saul and his sons are gone, the tribe of Judah declares David king. So, but Saul did have one more son named Ishbosheth, hard name to pronounce, and Ishbosheth declares himself king over the northern tribes. And so for 7 more long years, there's conflict between the northern tribes under Ishbosheth and the tribe of Judah under David. And the people around David are telling him, you should be king over it all. Why don't you just go take what's yours? Why don't you just take over the north? Get rid of Ishbosheth. God anointed you as the king, so, God wants you to have it, so just go claim what's yours. But over and over again, David would say, no, I'm not going to get it for myself. It's God's will, in God's way, in God's time. It's not about me. It's about what God has put in place. And so for 7 years this goes on, but Ishbosheth isn't a very good leader, and so he loses more and more support, and the northern tribes become weaker, while David, being a great leader, makes the tribe of Judah very strong. And finally, after 7 years, 2 of his military officers, who happen to be brothers, sneak into Ishbosheth's house while he's taking a nap, and they murder him in his sleep. And they do it because they think that they're going to get a reward from David, right? Because now they have removed the last obstacle to David being the king over the entire nation. And so they cut off Ishbosheth's head. They take it to David to give him the good news, get the reward. We read about it in 2 Samuel 4, verse 8. They brought the head of Ishbosheth to David at Hebron and said to the king, "Here is the head of Ishbosheth, son of Saul, your enemy, who tried to kill you." Now, when you read these stories, like the Old Testament is full of beheadings. Have you ever heard of that? Yeah, notice that? It's like, this is so gross. Why all the beheadings? Well, the answer is that they needed proof. They didn't have iPhones back then, so you could just take a picture of the dead guy, and prove that he's dead. They didn't have the live Facebook, so you could, live stream the killing in slow-mo. There had to be some evidence, right? And so the way to prove someone was dead was to show up with their head. In fact, I made that a little rhyme to make it easier to remember. The way to prove someone was dead was to show up with their head. Isn't that brilliant? You can feel free to share that one on Facebook or Instagram if you want. But really, there was no other option. You either lug the entire body around, and who wants to do that? Or carrying the head was a lot easier. So these 2 brothers murder Ishbosheth. They cut off his head, throw it in the bag, head for Hebron, which is where David was ruling at that time. They show up and they present it to David, expecting they're going to get a big reward because they've just removed the last obstacle to David being king over it all. They're so excited, they can't wait for the payday. And then David answered the 2 brothers, "As surely as the Lord lives, who has delivered me out of every trouble." In other words, the Lord is the one who delivered me out of trouble. He didn't ask for your help. He didn't ask you to do this. David continues, "When someone told me Saul is dead and thought he was bringing good news, I seized him and put him to death in Ziklag. That was the reward I gave him for his news." Now, all of a sudden, the brothers are not quite so excited because they realize that he's not reacting quite the way we thought he would, David continues, "How much more when wicked men have killed an innocent man in his own house and on his own bed?" At which time the people around with David might have been thinking, innocent man, Ishbosheth? He was claiming the kingdom that was yours, that you were anointed for. He's not innocent. But that's not how David thought. David is thinking it's God's will, God's way, in God's time. And so David continues, "Should I not now demand his blood from your hand and rid the earth of you?" So David gave an order to his men, and they killed them. But they took the head of Ishbosheth and buried it, which was a sign of honor. Well, after Ishbosheth is dead, the northern tribes finally declared for King David. And at last, finally, he would be king over the entire nation. After being a fugitive for 8 years, after being at war for 7 more years with the northern tribes, finally, chapter 5, verse 1, it says, "All the tribes of Israel came to David at Hebron and said, 'We are your own flesh and blood. In the past, while Saul was king over us, you were the one who led Israel on their military campaigns. And the Lord said to you, you will shepherd my people Israel, and you will become their ruler.'" So they're all saying, "Gabe, we all knew that you deserved to be king." Now they didn't do anything to make it happen, but they knew it. And honestly, this is no big surprise to anyone. The only thing they didn't really understand is why David didn't just grab it. Why didn't he just seize the throne when he had so many opportunities? In verse 3 it says, when all the elders of Israel had come to King David at Hebron, they came to crown him, to hand him over the power. In this moment, David shows his true greatness. In this moment, David applies everything that he has learned in the wilderness. In this moment, he shows the maturity that he didn't have at the age of 15 or 20, or even last week in our story at 22. But in this moment, he applies these lessons and shows his greatness. Because, think about this, he is already king of the south, which has become much stronger. And now the northern tribes, which are weak, are about to hand him all the power over them. And so he's holding all the cards. His word is law. He has already got all the influence. He's the most powerful person in the room, even without the crown over the north yet. But the next thing we see is that the king made a covenant with them at Hebron. Now, a covenant is basically like a contract. A covenant says, I'll do this if you'll do that, and if you do this, I'll do that. And it was an agreement where King David made promises to the people and committed things that he would do for them. And it was completely unnecessary. David didn't need to promise them anything. He was already the king in the south, which was stronger, and the north has no king, no leader, and no other options. And they're coming, David, please be king over us. He doesn't have to agree to any terms. He could just take it. So why in the world would he make a covenant with promises that he's committed to keep? Why, after being mistreated as a fugitive for all those years, and now he's facing a group of elders who didn't support him when he was on the run, and he could have been tempted to just take revenge right now, but instead he makes a covenant with these people. Why? And the last three words of the text explain it all. This is the point of the story. When all the elders of Israel had come to King David at Hebron, he made a covenant with them in Hebron before the Lord. You see, in this moment, David proclaimed to all of the people that he would be a king under authority, that he is not the ultimate authority, as most kings back then tried to behave. In this moment, he submitted himself to God's law, which meant that as a leader, he was actually submitting himself to the people over which he would rule. This was his way of saying, I am a king, but I am not the king. He, with all his other faults and foibles, David never confused himself with the king of Israel. Verse 3, it says, and they anointed David king over Israel. David was 30 years old when he became king, and he reigned 40 years. Now, that takes us through the story that we're going to cover this morning, and we'll pick it up again next week and take it right to the end. But now let's talk about the application of this. What does it mean for us today? And here's the point. David waited 15 years for God to give him what he had promised. And they were not 15 easy years. They were 15 very tough years. And during that time, he learned the hugely important lessons that would make him a good and a right king. He learned that leadership is always stewardship, and that even kings are accountable. And while this may seem very inspiring, and we say, oh yeah, way to go, David, you're great. The truth is, if you're a Christian, this kind of greatness is actually required for all of us. This is not an option where we can go, oh, David, way to go, but, I'm not in that situation. No. If you're a Jesus follower, if you're a Christian, it is not enough for you to be inspired. This kind of greatness is actually required. Why do I say that? 1,000 years later, just 20 miles north of Hebron, where all this took place, in the city of Jerusalem, Jesus would model this kind of greatness, but there would be a twist. The Apostle John tells us about it. John was there. He was an eyewitness of all these things, and he wrote about the incredible moment when Jesus modeled what David modeled. But Jesus modeled it with a twist. You all probably know the story. It was before Passover, and as Jesus and his disciples are finishing up the Passover meal, John, who was sitting at the table with them, tells us that somehow at this moment, Jesus knew that the hour had come for him to leave this world and go to his Father. Jesus knows in just a few hours he's going to be arrested, he's going to be tried, he's going to be crucified, by the very people that he came to save. And like David when he was in the wilderness, Jesus had been anointed by God, but was not recognized for who he was. He was not recognized as king. And also, like David, during this meal, Jesus would inaugurate a new covenant. When he took the cup, he said, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood." Not a new covenant between God and the 12 tribes of Israel, but a new covenant between God and all humankind. Not through the blood of an animal, but through Jesus' own blood. This was like the hinge moment of all of history. And John tells us that in this moment, he recognized that the end had come, but he goes farther than that. And this is critical. Let me read it to you. Jesus recognized that God had put all things. Now, hold on a second. Help me out here. How many things was that? All things? Are you sure it's not just some things? Now, Jesus had all things put under his authority, under his power. Jesus recognized he had power over everything in the whole universe. He had power. He recognized that in that moment, and that he had come from God and was returning to God. So he recognizes this fact that God has put all things under his authority, and what does he do with that power? That's the question we have to ask this morning, that each one of us individually has to ask. What do you do when you get power? That's the real question. Have you ever thought about what you would do? You know, I was reading the news this past week, and you know, it's almost hard to read the news without getting really depressed because the world is so messed up. You know, every country you can imagine, there's bad stuff going on, and so I started imagining, what would I do if I was the king? You know, if I had the power and I could really make changes, you know, what would I? It was really fun to imagine. You know, it's never going to happen, but you know, what would you do if you were king? What would you do? Or, you know, they say money is power, right? Have you imagined ever winning the Mega Millions jackpot? I've imagined that too. I don't even play the lottery, but I still imagine it. You know, and what I would do with all that money, you ever started planning out what you'd do if you were really wealthy? You would suddenly have a lot of power over people, wouldn't you, if you had that kind of wealth? What do you do when you're the most powerful person in the room, the most influential person in the room? What do you do when you've got the whole world in your hands? Well, John tells us what Jesus did. John 13, verse 3, it says, Jesus knew that the Father had put how many things? All things under his power, and that he had come from God and was returning to God. So he got up from the meal, took off his outer clothing, wrapped a towel around his waist. After that, he poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with the towel that was wrapped around him. And the disciples are going, no. They couldn't believe it. Peter says, don't do that. You know, we have people for that. We have slaves for that. We have servants for that. Jesus, put your clothes back on. You can't wash my feet, because you're a rabbi. You're a powerful teacher. In fact, you're the Messiah. You're the king, and kings don't wash people's feet, do they? Jesus ignored all the protests, and he humbled himself. He poured water into a basin, began to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with the towel that was wrapped around him. And then he put back on his robe, which signified that, yes, he did have authority as a rabbi. And he sat down. And I think that none of the disciples even dared to say a word at this point. They didn't need to say anything because Jesus had just given them the most powerful lesson that they would ever see. He had done something as an example that was so obvious. He didn't need to say a thing. But he did say something. I think maybe he said it for my benefit because I wasn't there. I think maybe he said it for your benefit. Here's what he said. He said, now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. I have set for you an example that you should do as I have done for you. If I'm not too good to wash your feet, and I'm the Lord and Master, then you're not too good to wash each other's feet, are you? Here's how I think Jesus would say it if he were here in this room today and talking to you and me. I think he would say, in those moments when you think you're something, in those moments when you think you're somebody, in those moments when somebody puts you in charge, when they give you the big promotion, when they show you to the corner office, when you retire with a bunch of money and you're not sure what to do with it, when you get the opportunity of a lifetime, when you realize that you have some power and some influence, when you realize how much you've been given by God, in that moment, what do? Look for more feet to wash. That's what you do with power. Because it's not all about you. And God gave you what you have. He gave you that influence so that you could use it for Him. And in fact, maybe the greatest reflection of your maturity or my maturity is what we do when we have authority, what we do when we have power, when we have influence. Maybe the thing that says more about you than anything else is what you do when it dawns on that you have power, you have authority, you have influence. How do we respond when it dawns on us that we're the most powerful person in the room, whether it's the classroom or the family room or the boardroom or any other room? Now, maybe you're saying right now, well, Ken, I don't have any power. I don't have much influence. Let me tell you, you have so much influence that you probably even have a title. For some of you, your title is father or mother or grandpa or grandma or husband or wife. Or maybe you're a manager or even an owner or administrative assistant. Or maybe your title is big brother or big sister. You probably have many of those titles. And let me tell you, every one of those titles gives you authority and influence in some area over some people. And so the question is, do you use your power for yourself? Or do you use it to benefit the other people in the room? As part of my quiet time every morning, I have a prayer list, but I also have a reminder list to remind me of the things that are really important, things that will change my life if I remember them. My prayer list is pretty long, but there's only 3 things on my reminder list. I've kind of added these 3 things over the years as I see things that I realize, you know what, this makes all the difference in my life if I remember this. And I've told you a couple of these things before, but let me share with you the 3 things I have on my reminder list. Number 1, I remind myself that the steps to joy are gratefulness, trust, and time with Jesus. I spent a number of years kind of depressed, and I don't want to be that anymore. So I live a joyful life now, and the way I do it is I remind myself every morning that the steps to joy are gratefulness, trust, and time with Jesus. If you don't believe it, you just try that. Second thing I remind myself every morning is to respond to offenses with amazing love. Tell you what, that is key to great relationships right there. You want to have great relationships, then every time somebody offends you or even you perceive an offense, somebody criticizes you, whatever, you respond with amazing love. You will have amazing relationships. Now, I'm still working on this one. Haven't got there yet, but I remind myself of that. Number 3, and I put this last one on the slide. My last reminder is this: act as if I am the most mature, loving, and powerful person in the room. Therefore, I must serve and love everyone else. Now, I say act as if, because the truth is I am usually not the most mature, loving, and powerful person in the room. But I want to act like I am because that's what Jesus told us to do. And how do you act that way? You do it by serving and loving everybody else in that room. Act as if I'm the most mature, loving, and powerful person in the room. Therefore, I must serve and love everyone else. That's what you do if you have power. That's how to be like Jesus. That's how you follow Jesus. That's what Jesus showed for us, what He modeled for us, and what David learned the hard way. That when you are the most powerful or the most wealthy or the most influential person in the room, you use your power for the benefit of the other people in the room. You use your power for the benefit of the other people that you have relationships with. That's what David learned in the desert, and that's what Jesus modeled at dinner with his disciples. I'd like the worship band to come up for a closing song. As they come up, let me read you one more scripture. This is from Jesus. It's like, just in case you missed my example before, just in case you didn't get it, here's what he says in Mark 10:43. Whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant. And whoever wants to be first must be slave of all. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. Jesus, our King, who has power over not just some, but all of the universe. Jesus, the King, did not come to be served, but to serve others and to give his life for other people. Imagine if all of us lived that way. Imagine if all of us used our influence that way. That kind of selflessness changed the world 2,000 years ago, and guess what? It's still changing the world today. Every time a follower of Jesus realizes, hey, I've got some power, I've got some influence, God has blessed me with it, and so what do? I've got to find some feet to wash. I've got to find some people to serve. I've got to find a way to use my influence for the benefit of the other people in the room. Let's stand for prayer. Will you bow with me? Heavenly Father, I pray for those of us here this morning who have great influence. And I pray for those people who have medium influence. And I pray for the people who have a little influence. For those of us who maybe are just a big brother, a big sister, or a friend. Would you give each of us wisdom to see how to apply these scriptures every day in our lives? Would you show us how to use our influence and use our power to be a blessing to the people around us? Would you help us to follow the call of Jesus, to follow his example, and to wash feet, and to serve others? God, we ask you to give us wisdom to know how to apply these things in our lives, and give us the courage to do it. In Jesus' name, amen.